are listening to the Moody Girl podcast with me, Emily Fazer. Throughout this series, we're going to be opening the minds of experts and delving into the world of alternative healing methods. So welcome, Julia, to the Moody Girl podcast.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for spending time with myself and the Moody Girl audience today. This episode is going to dive into all things sober positivity, sober curiosity, and how much it's changed your life for the better. I wanted to start by saying I have read your book, and congratulations, because it's a really refreshing take on being sober.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it. And that was my aim, really, in writing the book. It was because stopping drinking has been so transformative for me, and it was so surprising to me that I've been able to find this fun, joyful, great life on the other side of quitting alcohol, which was not anything that I expected to find on this side of not drinking. And so that was my aim, really, with the book. Well, it started off with my blogs on the community Soberistas, and then from that came the book to hopefully share the message more widely around the fact that it is possible to be sober positive, as the title of the book suggests.
Amazing. So for anyone who hasn't heard your story or who hasn't had the opportunity to read your book yet, can you tell us about a little bit more about your story? So, you're just mentioning before we started recording, it's your 6th year sober anniversary tomorrow. So
That's right.
Congratulations on that. That's a huge milestone. 6 years ago, wind back the clock. Where was your life then? Can you give us a little bit of context?
So 6 years ago, I was 40, just 40. It was my birthday yesterday, and so obviously now I'm 46. So I'd just turned 40. I had been out to celebrate my 40th and overdid it with alcohol yet again, which I had a tendency to do right from when I first started drinking as a kind of, I was 16, 17, as many people in the UK are. And was always kind of the one with no off switch. And in my 20s and early 30s, I was really very much a social drinker. I didn't drink at home, and my drinking, to most people, I would say, most people in the UK, would probably not have looked like anything particularly unusual, but it always had huge impacts on my mental health. And I'm really happy you've invited me to come on your podcast, because my mental health was always so tied up with my cycle and with what has subsequently eventually ended up being a diagnosis of PMDD, but I was undiagnosed for really probably the best part of 2 decades.
Wow.
And I would always find that when I was in that 2-week period when I was feeling awful with it, that alcohol would help. I would think it would help, but then obviously the after effects of alcohol would very much not help. So then I would be in this kind of horrible cycle. And then things kind of, in a way, took a bit of a turn when I had children. I had children kind of reasonably late in life. I was 36 when I had my eldest, 39 when I had my little one. And after that, I had postnatal depression. So once again, hello hormones, and not in a good way. And then my drinking kind of ended up being more at home at that stage, because obviously I wasn't able to go out because I had young children. So that was then when it started sort of ramping up in terms of the bottles of wine that I was getting through per week. And again, I mean, on paper, it maybe wouldn't have looked hugely concerning, but then combined with the fact that if it was someone's birthday or whatever, then I would still go out and have no off switch as well. That in terms of the kind of monthly consumption, it was getting to a level that I wasn't happy with, and getting to a level that I didn't feel was hugely compatible with good parenting. So I didn't plan to stop drinking completely on day one. So on the 19th of February 2017, I was waking up with a horrendous hangover, feeling awful that I'd overdone it yet again, that I had to breastfeed my little one when I'd had too much the night before. Just lots of shame around that, and lots of disappointment in myself that yet again I'd done the thing that I said I wasn't going to do, and then Googled help to stop drinking, and from there ended up finding a book called This Naked Mind by a lady called Annie Grace, who it's brilliant, that book, and it really changed my mindset around alcohol and around why I got into trouble with alcohol. And also the sober support community, Soberistas, which was started by a lady called Lucy Rocker 10 years ago now. They've just had their 10th anniversary, and found this wonderful community of women who were all kind of like me when it came to booze. It may be not the kind of stereotypical picture of a rock bottom alcoholic, but at the same time, alcohol was bringing more negatives to their lives than it was positives. And the combination of those two things, that mindset shift that I had around from Annie Grace's book around alcohol, and also the support that I had from the community at Soberistas, it kept me going with the journey. And I ended up not going back to drinking, and here I am 6 years down the line, still
Wow.
haven't had a drink since that day.
Well, good for you. That is absolutely incredible.
Thank
And
you.
I think we underestimate. I know for me, I know we touched on PMDD at the beginning of your story there. That was kind of what was the light bulb moment for me, realizing that it wasn't just me experiencing this, that when I found all the Facebook communities and IAPMD and all of the, the information that I hadn't had for years, it makes you feel less crazy, and you're like, oh, actually, okay, I can speak to other people about this. And when you find that community, that's just so important. So I'm so glad that you found that. And thank you for sharing that. So any audience who think that they can benefit from those communities, please do check them out online. So yeah, from reading your book, that was one thing which you just mentioned that I found really, really interesting. And it's the term of alcoholic. So what that in society has been portrayed as, and I loved in your book, you used an analogy that you kind of, or a perception of what you had created in your head for an alcoholic as being the old vicar out of Father Ted.
Yeah.
And it's so true. I laughed out loud because I was like, oh my God, that's so true. Because, we watch all these sketch shows and we watch all these comedians, and that's the way that it's always been portrayed online and in television and movies, all of this, you imagine an alcoholic to be someone who's, got a bottle of spirits in their hand, walking down the street, doesn't have a job, doesn't know, all these things. But actually, it really made me think how you said that. And, there's so many people functioning, but it's the lifestyle that we now have, especially in the UK. We're all quite nervous socially. And the way that we relax is from having a drink.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what would you describe the stages of having a problematic relationship with alcohol look like? Are there any red flags or anything that may not be as obvious? But what do you think those might be?
I think a phrase that I used to hear before I stopped drinking, and it used to scare the life out of me because it kind of indicated to me that probably I did need to do something about my drinking, is if it's a problem for you, it's a problem. And that used to make me think, well, my drinking is a problem for me because I worry about it all the time. Therefore, does that mean I'm an alcoholic? And actually, what I found so liberating about This Naked Mind, the book I mentioned, was that she kind of said, well, alcohol's addictive. And that just flipped my thinking about it completely, because I've been so caught up in this thinking of, well, there's alcoholics who get into trouble with alcohol, and there's people who are not alcoholics. And if you're not an alcoholic, you're okay. And so I was so desperate to not be an alcoholic so that I could keep drinking, that nothing else really entered into my considerations. And a lot of my worries about the whole situation were, am I an alcoholic? And if I'm an alcoholic, then I'll have to stop drinking. And and then I'd sort of like get all this evidence. I was almost like a detective, kind of looking for evidence as to why I wasn't an alcoholic. Well, I'm not an alcoholic because I don't drink in the morning. I'm not an alcoholic because there was that one time when I was really moderate and I came home and I'd had enough to drink after a few. Or I'm not an alcoholic because I'm not as bad as X, Y, and Z person. And really all of that was just kind of like smoke and mirrors that was hiding the fact from me that my drinking was a problem for me because of the way that I felt after I'd had a night of overdoing it, the way that I felt out of control with it, the way that it impacted my mental health. I used to have the most awful kind of anxiety in the morning, that kind of feeling of morning after anxiety, and that was getting worse and worse the older I got, definitely. And that was also very much tied up with my hormones. It got worse after I had my children, when I was in that postnatal depression kind of period. It was just horrendous. So all of that I kind of almost put to one side and said, well, that's okay. I can cope with all that as long as I'm not an alcoholic, because if I'm an alcoholic, I'll have to stop drinking, because stopping drinking just seems like this worst case scenario, and the thing that you want to avoid at all costs, because we're kind of told that by everyone, including, and this again was a big driver for me in kind of making my story so public and writing the book, because there is this kind of perception from absolutely everybody, including the health professions and everybody, who that nobody kind of gives you as an option, well, you could just voluntarily stop drinking and you might feel better. It's always about cut down, moderate, control your consumption, unless you meet this threshold of being an alcoholic, in which case you absolutely have to stop and never drink again. And it's this terrible worst case scenario. But before you get to that threshold, you have to just be moderate and control it. And for me personally, that trying to be moderate and controlling it was just so incompatible with my personality, with the physiological effects that alcohol has on me, that it is just far too much hard work. It's just exhausting. And it's so much easier and more freeing for me to just say, okay, that's not for me. What else can I put my energy into? So in terms of, it's a difficult one in terms of kind of red flags, because I think that everybody is unique and individual, and alcohol as a drug, which it is a drug, will have a different physiological effect slightly on everyone, and also different at different phases in our lives. As I said, it got worse for me after I had children because of those hormonal shifts. So there's that in it. But I would say it's about the damage it's doing in your own mind, really. And I think that being honest with ourselves and trying to not be afraid of the possibility that alcohol might be something that we struggle to moderate, I think is maybe that's the kind of sticking point for so many people, because it feels like such a terrifying thing to have to accept about yourself. And I was terrified of it. I was absolutely on the day one 6 years ago, I didn't, if somebody had told me that 2 years following that I would be writing a book called Sober Positive, I would have absolutely laughed my head off, because it didn't feel like a positive thing to not be able to drink anymore at that stage.
Yeah, it's amazing how you've turned that round, though, that really kind of dark time, and turned it into such a freeing and positive thing. And I think that's what I took from your story, that you kind of flipped it on its head. And I mean, even I do dry January almost every year, and I find that so enjoyable. At first I tried to do it, and it was like honestly like a prison sentence. I was like, oh God, it's like 10 days in, and then the older I'm getting, the more I'm really enjoying it. But then it's funny when you hear people's reactions to, oh yeah, I'm doing dry January or something, and oh God, boring, or and it without realizing it, it impacts you, because you're like, oh God, am I boring? Should I just let my hair down and go with the flow a bit? And it's annoying how we feel that you can't relax and go with the flow by being sober, because you totally can. It's just this perception that's so woven into society, and especially British culture. I mean, we spend so much time down the pub. And my husband and I, we were having a conversation about it the other day, and I was like, I don't know if I enjoy going to the pub. I was like, really, honestly, I'd rather go somewhere else, to a cafe, and or go for a nice walk. And we were kind of going on with this thing about British culture and how the pubs are kind of part of who we are. But it's funny that pubs are so ingrained in our culture, because that's where you get absolutely legless,
Yeah, that's it. And I think for me, it's opened my world up so much, because I was very focused around alcohol. I remember I used to really struggle with that bit on your CV where you had to put interests and whatever, because my interest was going out for meals and drinks and drinking, basically. So, with friends, but socializing, but
Yeah.
always with alcohol. So I didn't really have much in the way of hobbies. I didn't do any sports or anything. It was, my social life was very much based around drinking. And I it's funny because I don't, because even though I'm a sober person, I kind of don't ever want to come across as like the fun police. I don't, and I feel sometimes I feel still, even though I'm very open, obviously, about my story, about like I almost don't want to tell people that I don't drink, because I don't want people to instantly make that kind of like eye roll, that, oh well, you're no fun then, kind of thing. Because I didn't obviously stop drinking because of some sort of holier than thou anything. It was I stopped drinking because I had to, because it was making my life miserable. And from there, I've built up a life that's brilliant, and I'm actually happier now than I can ever remember being as a drinker, because it did always cast this shadow over my life that I wasn't even really aware of. But the difficult, and it's been a journey to get to this point, because there is that process of learning how to do everything differently, learning how to socialize differently, learning how to manage stress differently, and all of that. And but now I've got to a place where I'm so much happier than I ever was as a drinker, and I have more fun than I ever did as a drinker.
It's so interesting. I mean, when you spoke earlier about how alcohol, you tended to go for alcohol when you're going through hormonal fluctuations, and
Mm,
especially in your luteal phase.
yeah.
So how is that for you now? So when you're going through your luteal phase, have you noticed a difference 6 years sober?
It's difficult to say, because I'm now on hormonal treatment for
Mhm.
PMDD, but I wouldn't be on that if I hadn't stopped drinking. There's no
Mhm.
way that I would have, because one of the things I think that happened to me when I stopped drinking was that I then kept going with not settling for feeling a bit crappy in any way. So if there were things like I've changed, well, I've not really changed careers, but I've adjusted careers, and I've got like a second career. I've done some retraining, and also obviously writing the book as well. I have separated from my former partner, so there's loads of things that have shifted in my life, because when you're sober and you're kind of there for all of it, you have to you can't accept things that make you feel crappy. So, and one of those things was, of course, the PMDD, which was still there. I started antidepressants as part of my part when I had postnatal depression, and I still take them, because that is also another part of my treatment for it. But that it's still I still had at least a week a month of, like, the last week of my luteal phase feeling not great, and as a result, I really pushed for a medical referral. And as chance would have it, a lovely lady who I know, she comes and gives me a massage once a month. It's my little treat to myself, but she's a friend as well. And she recommended this consultant in Manchester. She said, all the ladies, this, if you've got anything hormonal, anything gynae, you've got to go to this guy. And so I managed to get a referral on the NHS to this consultant. And he's the first person that's ever really, like, properly taken me seriously. And I went with, like, this list of, these are all the symptoms that I have, and finally having actual proper treatment for it. So that is like 3 monthly hormone blocking injections that I'm sure that some of the listeners will be having similar treatment, will know what I'm talking about. And so I have that, and then I have some HRT kind of put back in. So essentially I'm having treatment now that gives me normal hormones, basically. And I'm not going to have a hysterectomy, which is a huge relief, though, because I know that some people do have to go to that extreme. And yes, but I don't have periods, so I don't have a monthly. I said to somebody fairly recently that this must be like what it's like being a man, because
Mm.
my moods are just they just are what they are, and they fluctuate depending on life and what's going on around me, but I don't have that monthly up and down that I'd always had.
That's so interesting. I mean, I went as far because I went to Chelsea and Westminster at PMS clinic,
Mm.
and I went to the HRT as far as that, and then I was on that for about 5 years, and then I kind of discussed it with my husband, and we were like, let's, during the lockdown, I just basically cut everything out, slowly wean myself off it. Now I'm natural,
Mm,
but I still do experience those fluctuations. Definitely. I mean, today I'm 4 days away from my period,
mm,
and I woke up this morning and I was like, oh God, I do have that.
yeah.
But I try different ways of working it, and I always am so
Mm,
interested in hearing different people's treatment plans and how it works for them, because I do think PMDD is so unique, like sobriety, and
mm,
to the individual and what's going on in our life. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us and the audience. Um, so you also mentioned in your book that when you were trying for children, I know you touched on that you're a little bit older in life. I'm
mm,
33, still don't have children yet.
mm,
So hoping I'll probably be a similar age if all goes well, and to you.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, what I found really interesting from that part of the book was it was like you were almost relieved when you started. You're like, okay, I've got a reason to stop now. So we're trying
Mm,
for children.
yeah.
And then you got pregnant, and then it was like, yep, don't need to drink, and it was just lovely for you. And then it
Mm,
was almost like as soon as the children were born, it was like this thing, like a monkey on your shoulder, just like,
mm,
hello, when are you going to come back to this life before you had children?
mhm,
And yeah, that really struck a chord with me, because I think even, my the longest I've ever not drank was during the lockdown.
mm,
Um, I had 3 months furloughed at home, and for me, because it was furloughed, it was a really fortunate position to be in, because I was still being paid, but I didn't have to go anywhere. I
mm,
didn't have to see anyone. I didn't have FOMO of people at the pub. And it really gave me the opportunity to just really stop alcohol. So I was working out, stopping alcohol. I came off HRT, looked at my diet, all of these things. But it was a transitioning out of that hit
mm,
me like a ton of bricks, because I wasn't prepared for it. Um,
mm,
and I remember the first day kind of being in a situation where people were drinking around me, and I burst into tears because I was just like, oh God, I can't do this. I'm such a loser. And I think from what you've said and what you mentioned about the book that you were reading, it's all in the mindset. And I think that's
mm,
where I got it wrong. So I was very much just doing it, and I felt great, but it was great. It was easy enough to do it when the whole world is locked down. But when you
mm,
have to go back into everyday life, that's where I think, when you say about the mindset with drinking
mm,
alcohol changed.
mm.
So I mean, can you talk the audience through the main sort of shifts that we need to look at? Say if anyone is sober curious, or they are going through their own sober journey, what are those shifts they can look at?
Absolutely. So for me, the big shift was, as I've already said, the getting past that alcoholic, not alcoholic binary, and really seeing alcohol use as it is, which is a spectrum of shades of grey, from the most moderate, don't really like the taste of alcohol even, but will have one to be polite at weddings drinker, all the way up to the person drinking a bottle of spirits a day. And there isn't any point on that where everybody will definitely be an alcoholic, and on the other side everybody definitely won't. It's the point at which it starts to become a problem is different for everybody at different points of that spectrum. And that for me was huge, because it stopped me thinking in those terms of, well, as long as I'm not an alcoholic, I can keep drinking and should keep drinking, and started me down a path of more making genuine decisions for my health, and thinking, well, what is the right decision for me, for my health, and for my mental health, for my physical health. I know that not drinking alcohol is the right path for me. And then I think the other shift was meeting the community of ladies at Soberistas, and seeing in real time people that were further down the path from me, who were going out and having a brilliant time. One of my friends got invited to the Brits, and she was in her first 6 months, and she went sober to the Brits, and she had a 40th sober, and was doing all this stuff. And her blogs on Soberistas were huge for me, because I was 4 weeks sober, having that exact experience that you describe, of going out, seeing my friends in real life, thinking, oh God, why can't I do that? And it's not fair. But then seeing somebody who was 6 months down the line, 8 months down the line, going out and doing stuff and coming back and saying, do you know what, that was amazing, and I remember every bit of it, and I had so much fun, and just seeing what was possible, I guess, which is why then I suppose I in turn have tried to kind of pay it forward and do the same, and report on my experience all the way through the journey, really. So I think that's the two big things. I mean, community has been massive for me. Sorry, I should take a swig of water.
Yeah, it's fine.
Community has been massive for me. I don't think I could have done it on my own. I think having other people around me who were going through the same thing, and as I said, that kind of seeing the example of how they were living brilliant lives without alcohol was really huge. So I think that's kind of, they're the two big things, because what I describe it in my book is about there's a chapter where I talk about option C, because I think I had always thought that the two options were to carry on drinking and be miserable about my drinking some of the time, or to stop drinking and be miserable about my drinking all of the time because I couldn't do it anymore. And they felt like the only two options. So if they were the only two options, then obviously it's better to carry on with the, well, I'm only miserable about it some of the time. What I never considered was that there was an option about stopping drinking and just leaving it behind, and building a life that I'm happy with, and not being miserable about alcohol at all, which is where I've been able to get to.
That's so good. And when you first, see, when you joined Soberistas, you're reading blogs, and then all of the friends, I know you said you had a good circle of friends who used to go and have, abundance of alcohol with. What happened once you got sober? Were they accepting of that? How were you comfortable being around alcohol? How long did it take for you to, not feel like you wanted that drink when everyone else around you might be?
It took a while, definitely took a while. And I think I was fortunate in that, I think it's definitely, I'm not saying, I wouldn't want any of your listeners who were younger or who were in more kind of booze-centric friendship groups to think that what I'm saying doesn't apply to them, because I think anybody can get through this period. I know people on Soberistas who have done that. But for me, I was fortunate in that I was in my 40s, just in my 40s. All my friends had small children, and the nights out were getting increasingly low key anyway, and so my inability to moderate, or well, I suppose I wasn't always unable to moderate, but my tendency to take it too far on occasion. So if it was a night out for someone's birthday, for example, I would generally be the one who'd be like, why is everyone going home, come on, let's stay out, let's wanting to keep the party going. And that tendency was kind of starting to stick out a bit more. And actually I found that when I stopped drinking, I became almost like a detective of other people's drinking, not in a judgy way, but just in okay, so that person doesn't actually drink very much at all. Was that always the case? Did I just not notice that before? And it was fascinating. And actually, I found that for the vast majority of my friends who still drink, it just wasn't an issue, because they don't drink enough to become really annoying and drunk and that much different to how they are when they're sober. So it just became a bit of a non-issue, really, with most of them.
Wow.
A couple of friendships shifted quite a bit, but then there was other things going on there as well. One of my friends has also stopped drinking as well. So there's been different things have happened, but I think overall as a group we've become a lot less about the booze anyway, because we're older and we've got young children, which is obviously quite incompatible with hangovers. So
totally.
there was definitely that side of it. But I think it was a real gradual thing for me, and there was little high points on the journey, I suppose. There was, at first, I find on a sober night out with drinkers that there can be this kind of, at first it can feel a bit awkward, and that's still the case for me at 6 years sober, when everybody else gets a drink and starts to kind of settle into the night. I can sometimes feel a bit, I'd quite like to be able to take the edge off, but it passes. And as other people relax into the night, then I find that I relax into the night as well. And you can get tons of lovely alcohol-free drinks now that look like the real thing, so you don't feel like you're sat at the kids' table with your little tumbler of orange juice.
I know that's the key as well. I remember I went to like a girls' lunch, and it was very like, bottles of wine on the table, and I'd made the decision I was going to do this without alcohol. And I think I got like a kombucha, but I got it in a wine glass. And they were like, oh, what's that? And I was like, oh, it's kombucha. I remember this one girl who didn't know that that well was just like, oh no, remind me not to get that one, you know. And I remember at the time
Yeah.
it really cut deep, and I was like,
Mm,
oh. And I remember just obsessing over that one comment when I was driving home,
mm,
almost punishing myself for it. So I think it's really refreshing, and you know, I don't know about you, but I find maybe with the younger Gen Z, Generation Z, they seem to be much healthier than, you know, I was at that age. You know, it seems like
mm,
a lot of the children in the people in the gym are much younger. I mean, I definitely
mm.
wasn't in the gym when I was a teenager. It's probably
Yeah.
being, you know, hanging out on street corners drinking cider with mates, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And also they seem to not be drinking as much,
Mm,
which is a great movement. And I feel like more than ever, people are talking about sobriety in a positive way, and you know, looking at the ways that we can rejig our lives. And I mean, for you, you've got a lot on your plate. So you've got your blog, you've got your own book that's out, you've got your own podcast. I
mm,
noticed that you also are a coach, psychologist as well.
mhm.
So would you say all of these things came after getting sober?
Definitely, 100%. So I still do the same kind of day job, if you like, as I did before stopping drinking, and I still have the same children, obviously. Other than that, my life is completely different. I didn't have, obviously, hadn't written the book, didn't have the podcast, didn't have a blog. Kind of wanted to blog. I tried doing like a parenting blog, like had these kind of sporadic attempts at that, but it just never kind of came to anything, and just never got off the ground with it. But I always wanted to write. There was always that in me that I wanted to write. And also, yeah, the I retrained as a therapist, so that I only qualified last summer. So that's been like the last 4 years I've been retraining, and I've now
Congratulations.
just thank you, and now I've just started my practice, which I'm absolutely loving. It's just such a dream to be able to do it and actually get paid for it. It's amazing.
Oh,
I kind of, I would say I do it for free. I do it for free. I volunteer as well for a women's refuge, but yeah, it's just crazy to be able to enjoy something that much and make money doing it is amazing. So yeah, my life's very different, very, very different. And I wouldn't have done, I would say, any of it if I hadn't stopped drinking. Sure. And yeah, I think it's interesting what you're saying about Gen Z. My friend Liz, one of my sober besties who I do my podcast with, she was actually saying on our last episode that her son, who's a teen, is really like, yeah, it's just a bit embarrassing, mum, to be honest, when when people overdo it, and we're just not interested in it. And I think maybe social media's had quite a lot to do with that, because
mm,
obviously for me, when I was drinking, it was in the 90s. When I started drinking, it was in the 90s, and it's like, there was very little in the way of evidence of whatever we were up to, whereas now everything's kind of pictures of everything and online, and everybody's trying to look their best, and it's maybe not compatible with messy drinking.
yeah, it's so true. I mean, also, if you think about, because I'm a millennial, born 89, and I mean, all of the kind of bands that were glamorized were smoking cigarettes, having pints of beer, or you know, and it was so glamorized. And
Mm,
I mean, when I think back to one of my first experiences of drinking, I think I had like two Bacardi breezes after the prom, and I was 16.
yeah.
And I've always been someone who I can have a sniff of wine and I feel a bit drunk. And
Mm.
I had two Bacardi breezes, and I remember it was all round school that, oh, Emily's wild when she's drunk. She took her top off and she was running around the garden in her bra. And I honestly to this day can't remember it. But I was just like, Jesus. And I had anxiety at 16. And I'm like,
Yeah.
33 now, come on. But I mean, if that was a Gen Z, I mean, that would be all over TikTok or whatever.
Mm,
And that would probably ruin me for the rest of, you know, my school years. So yeah, so thank God we didn't have that back in the day.
yeah.
Um, so for a last question before we go to ask the audience, I wanted you, you know, to ask you if any of the audience feel like they might have a problematic relationship with alcohol, where do they start? You know, what's the first stage of admitting it, I guess? How do you even start?
I would say maybe get reading, but there's so much out there in terms of the books that you can obviously read a book. You can download a book to a Kindle or a phone now, and nobody will ever be any the wiser. If you feel like you don't want to even discuss it with another person, then just start. And I'm not just saying that because I'm trying to flog my book. There's tons of really good books out there that can really help with that kind of getting your head straight around it, because it's something that does feel very much still like it's hard to talk about. I certainly would never have discussed my worries about my drinking with friends in the same way that I would have discussed maybe trying to quit smoking or a diet, or trying to lose weight, that kind of thing. So I think definitely that's a good place to start. And also podcasts as well. There's quite a few sobriety podcasts out there as well. Again, not trying to not trying to sell mine, because it isn't actually a sobriety podcast. But yeah, so I think kind of just kind of check into all the information that's out there. And if you then from that feel like stopping drinking is something that you would want to give a go, even if it's just a break, then connect with a sobriety support community. And I mean, obviously I would always recommend Soberistas because it's been so transformative for me, and that's my kind of my sober home online. But I'm also that yeah, I'm aware of quite a few others, and I haven't ever come across a sober community that's been in any way anything less than wonderfully welcoming and really supportive. And the same with sober social media as well. I'm not a huge fan of social media. I tend to, for my own mental health, I tend to kind of dip into it as infrequently as possible. I tend to feel better when I don't. But the sober social media again is really supportive, really inspirational. So there's a lot out there in terms of connection and just kind of seeing what the other side is like, really, I suppose, and just seeing and to take it from there. And then my next step beyond that was to eventually speak to a therapist. And I suppose that's the kind of the equivalent of, if you're not doing, because the AA program obviously takes you through these kind of formal steps, and if you're not doing that, I did find it helpful to almost do like my own version of that, kind of looking at myself and looking at why I drank and looking at what was kind of behind it all. And that was a helpful process for
Mm.
me as well. So I'd say sort of that they're the kind of the three things would be kind of community, support with your mental health, because it's kind of it's a challenging thing to do, and information, because there's tons out there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Those are all
No
amazing
problem.
points. So we've now come to the part in the show where we have a few questions from our social media audience.
Right.
And so we're going to go straight into it. How do you deal with work stress when your go-to is having a drink? I've been sober since January and usually drink a lot, but I'm now finding it really hard not to drink after a stressful day.
Um, First of all, I would definitely say hang on in there, because as time goes on, you will have less work stress because you're not drinking. That is definitely something that I've found to be true for me and every sober person that I know, that general overall levels of stress and anxiety do dial down over time of being sober. In terms of what I do in the moment after a stressful day, I find running really helps. I'm not a big runner. I'm not mega fit, but there's something about exercise that can just do that kind of instant state shift. And I feel like running's it's almost like the opposite of drinking, in the sense that when you drink, because you get the stress relief, but then you kind of have the price to pay potentially afterwards in terms of the anxiety the next day, or just the even one glass of alcohol will have an effect on your sleep, which is obviously not then going to help with stress long term. Whereas running, you kind of you're making your payment up front, but then there's no bad after effects. And that's always been a big help, and particularly in early sobriety, when the stress would be kind of compounded by, not only was I stressed by a bad day, but I was also stressed because I had a bad day and I couldn't drink, that I'd just get to a kind of state. And that was, definitely exercise was a big help for me. Also food, having something really nice to eat, obviously kind of trying to not go overboard with that, because then that can cause problems in itself. But yeah, definitely having nice things to eat, or a nice hot drink, that kind of, having sort of sober treats is the way it's often referred to in sober communities, making sure that you've got a lot of kind of sober treats identified, that you can, if you feel like you need to really treat yourself and look after yourself, you can do that. And also having boundaries, and I didn't have boundaries when I drank. I had no boundaries whatsoever in terms of telling the people in my life what I needed. And I think I had to get a lot better at that as a sober person, in the sense of, if I'd had a bad day, I'd have to say to my husband at the time that, I just need an hour or half an hour or whatever it is. And can you cope with the kids? And, I know it's not always that easy for people, but certainly that would be my kind of my advice as far as I can think. But it's difficult. It is really difficult when when you're used to having that fast track to relaxation. There isn't anything as a sober person that 100% replaces it, but over time you don't need it anyway, because your overall levels of stress come down.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. So what alternative ways are there to feel comfortable in social situations other than drinking alcohol? Without drinking, I would be way less social and feel really awkward.
I think, as I said, that it's a weird thing, the awkwardness. I would never have anticipated this, but what I generally find is that I'll have about half an hour at the start of a night where I kind of still feel a bit, I'm the sober one. But then as the evening goes on and other people relax because they've had a few drinks, I will also relax. It's a really weird thing. It's almost like the kind of the overall atmosphere of the group is almost a bit contagious. I also find that I get a surprising amount of placebo effect from things that taste like alcoholic drinks, like alcohol-free beer and tonic water, and things that, rather than drinking something sweet, which it's a weird thing, but our brains are kind of doing half the work for us, really, even when we're drinking actual alcohol. And it's surprising how much of that can still be recaptured by something like an alcohol-free beer. And and then just focus, kind of doing a bit of reframing, really. This is the therapist in me coming out, but I find that reframing on the things that are positive about the night that wouldn't have been the case if I'd been drinking. So, for example, if I still, because I would quite often come home from a night out if I'd overdone it with drink, with kind of makeup not the best, and not looking my best, shall we say. And the fact that I can come home from a night out looking exactly the same as I did when I went out, and makeup's in place and hair's in place, and that is still to this day a real, it doesn't get old. So there's that. And to focus on the things that are still good about the night out. And I think that has made me over time be a lot more choosy about what I'll do socially. But when I do say yes to something, it's because I know that there are things that I will get a lot of enjoyment from, whether it's having delicious food, or going to see a band that I love, or dancing to music that I love, or spending time with people who genuinely light me up and make me feel great. And over time, alcohol becomes just less and less a thing, really, in your life, I suppose, is the way to put it. But it's a journey, and it doesn't happen overnight.
Okay, brilliant. And I got one more. What do you do in your spare time when before you were drinking?
I mean, I would say I probably don't have a huge amount of spare time anymore, because of obviously I do now have a full-time job plus an additional career as a therapist, that I work a couple of evenings a week seeing clients, and I have a podcast, and I have just finished my second book. So I've become a bit of a workaholic, I suppose. But also I do things that I enjoy doing. I run, I do yoga. I love hot yoga, especially. I do that as much as I can. I see friends. I go out for meals still. I'm in a choir, which kind of, that meets my need for a bit of kind of drama and performance that kind of came along with a drunken night out in some ways.
Oh, that's nice.
So I love that. I love my choir. So yeah, that's kind of it, really. But I've got young kids, so it's a lot of my life is about them, which
But
is
I
great.
think that's amazing, though. I think, as you say, before you felt like you didn't have any hobbies. And that's something I've spoken to my husband about a lot. And a lot of people I know, and especially as you're touching on with your CV, socializing.
Yeah,
Socializing is just a code word for going to the pub and getting pissed with friends, isn't it?
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's a whole long list that you've just said there. So I mean, that is incredible.
Yeah, I feel like I have a very full life now, which is great. And I've got more friends as well, because I've still got the friends that I used to have, but I've also got sober friends that I do other stuff with. So last weekend I went over to see my friend Liz in Liverpool, and we went swimming in the Irish Sea because she does that now. That's been one of her kind of sober things that she discovered in lockdown. So yeah, I do more stuff and have more fun for sure.
Brilliant. Well, honestly, it's been so interesting this week. I've really immersed myself in your life, I feel, with your book and now having an amazing chat with you. And I think it's so refreshing to hear how far you've come and how positive you are about your sobriety. So listeners at home, feel free. I'll put the link to Julia's book in the link to the bio. And
Oh,
you
thank
really,
you.
really should read it. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time today, Julia.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant. Well, have a lovely weekend and take care.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.